The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 7. 8. The envoy walked for 57 days. Though he had fleeting thoughts while he walked, he mostly found himself in a thoughtless trance. He walked all day, and for as much of the night as he had light for, depending on the behavior of the moon. He estimated each day on the planet was about 12 hours, so it was slowing down. The moon, Earth's once beautiful smooth white skylight, had been pocked and damaged from what appeared to be thousands of impacts, and was further away than it had been when he arrived. His thick beard itched terribly. He scratched at his face and especially his neck constantly as he walked. Of the 57 days, it rained for 43. He collapsed unconscious 19 times, drank 190 bottles of water, and ate fully half of the food that he had left. A little after noon on the 57th day, he thought he could see water. The more he walked, the more he was sure it was an ocean. 30 minutes later, he was stripping off his gear and his clothes and charging into the rolling waves. It was one of the nice days, no clouds, and the sun was bright and strong. He swam in the surf for a few minutes. The water rushing over his skin and through his beard felt heavenly, and then floated on his back, smiling. Eventually he drifted closer and closer to shore, and once he felt his heels touch the rocky bottom, he stood and walked back to the beach. He walked up to where he had dropped his bag, retrieving his clothes as he went. Bag in hand, he walked back down to the beach and stood, waiting for the ocean breeze to dry him off enough so he could dress. While he waited, the envoy retrieved a bottle of water and drank about half of it before deciding he was dry enough. Clothed and warm, he sat next to his small stow of possessions on the hard pan of the beach, enjoying the natural melody of the waves. He smiled. His next task was the first actual work he had to do in a long while. It was the first task on the mission plan for a new, young planet. Everything until that point had been surviving. That task would wait until the next day. He wanted to enjoy his time on the beach and rest up, as his next journey would begin the next day. The sun was setting behind him, and the surf was a beautiful sight. He stood and walked up the beach to give himself a buffer between himself and the crashing waves. About 30 yards up the beach, he made his camp, which in the warm weather was his blanket rolled into a pillow and nothing else. He laid flat on his back and stared at the sky. The light blue dimmed into orange and red, and then a deep blue and purple as the stars faded in. As it was happening, he drifted into sleep, exhausted. 9. Cold, cold and wet. His legs were cold and wet. The envoy awoke to find the ocean had climbed all the way up the beach. He stood up in the moonlight and picked up his bag, satchel, and the half-full bottle of water he had been drinking. With the satchel safely around his neck, he stowed the bottle in his pack and slung it over his shoulder. He watched the waves crashing in and walked backwards as they approached and reached his feet. He walked that way for only 2 minutes before tiring of it and turning to walk away from the surf. To his complete amazement, it chased him almost a mile across the surface of the earth before it paused and then receded. He stood in the cold white light offered by the moon and watched as the ocean left him behind, with only damp ground as evidence it had ever been there. At that moment, he did not understand why the Earth's tidal phenomenon existed in the extremes it did, and then he noticed his crystal-clear midnight shadow and understood perfectly. He looked up at the moon. "It's you, isn't it?" It felt good to speak, to engage, even though the moon would not answer him. "You are responsible for this. Do you know how much harder this will make the next part of my mission?" The envoy was smiling. It was like being mad at an innocent child. Although he could recognize the added work to his already strenuous task, it was equally amazing that such a phenomenon existed at all. He lay down on the ground where he stood, wanting to view the tidal termination point in the full daylight. 10. The envoy could not believe he missed it. He concluded that he must have seen the ocean before reaching the termination line, and been so distracted that he did not notice the abrupt and permanent color change. The ground went from a sun-baked white to a heavier dark beige over the course of only 15 yards. This line extended away from him north and south for as far as he could see. Geared up, he strode back toward the receding ocean. 15 minutes was all it took, and the surf was again only 30 yards away. He did not want to take the chance of the sun drying out and killing the first dosing he made, so he once again stripped down to nothing and opened his bag. He pulled the purse out, the small bag within a bag, and opened it. Inside was a rectangular Dory 10 packet with a snap clasping a flap at the top to the main body. He pulled the snap apart and inspected the contents. The molded packet held 25 small vials, 10 missing, 15 remaining. The dosing prescription was 5 vials per planet, but the most any envoy would ever need would be 20 if every planet after their first was a newborn. Always over-engineering and inserting redundancy was the Orris project. The envoy had no need for them on the first 3 planets and had used 10, double the prescription, on Telraid. He removed one of the last 15 vials, resnapped the packet, and put it away. He held the vial up to the daylight to inspect its contents. There was nothing in the vial but salt, except it was special. The labs added cyanobacteria in suspended animation to the slurry before allowing the crystals to form. Cyanobacteria, the beautiful little gem that multiplied and pumped the atmosphere full of oxygen. He took a deep breath to remind himself how unsatisfying the current air was. It was likely that the planet had already established life in one corner or another, but by seeding the ocean with the bacteria locked in the salts, he would help the planet's biology move toward oxygen dependence. Vial sealed and in hand, he walked to the ocean and waded out, only diving in when he was about to be pulverized by an enormous wave. The envoy swam out until his remaining energy level was concerning. His muscles burned, and the fatigue was alarming. He stopped and treaded in place. Slowly spinning, he located the shore and noted that he was drifting south. His belongings were to the right of his current position. He again treaded in a spin until his back was to the shore. Holding the vial in front of his face and placing both thumbnails together and centered, he snapped it, resulting in a spider web of cracks and weak stress lines in the material. Gripping each end, he folded it back and forth until a split appeared on one side of the bend. He shook the contents into the ocean water and then flicked the container further into the sea. He took a deep breath, arched his back, and floated back to the shore. When he arrived at his bag, the surf was only 4 or 5 feet from touching it. Setting it up on end made it easier to spot, since so much of the land looked exactly the same. He hoisted his bag up on his shoulder and began his escape from the tide. When he reached the terminator, he ate, relaxed, thought about his next move, and eventually slept. The ocean had left him again, but he knew it would be back when it was dark and preferred sleeping on dry land. 11. Sleep was deep and restful. He woke up refreshed but anxious, knowing his next decision would be critical. North or south? He could not see mountains in either direction, but he had to choose, and he had to stay on the coast to make at least 4 more salt deposits. The planet had a tilt, which meant seasons, and the potential of freezing and snow to the north, as he was already north of the equator. South meant a lower likelihood of mountains, and potentially more geologic activity over the next billions of years. His long run. He thought about it while he walked back to the coast. Left, right, left, right. The envoy spent the next 17 minutes slowly concluding that although the northern route might be more painful, it was also the route he was more likely to survive. North, then. His gait bent to the left. When he reached the coast, he again performed his planetary life dosing ritual, located his possessions, and walked due north, letting the encroaching sea push him westward. As he walked north and slid west, always scanning the horizon, he felt a pang of depression, which his subconscious immediately addressed. The correction came in the voice of Dr. Christine Page, dead for billions of years by that point. There are many things that are more dangerous than my mind. Don't let my mind become more dangerous than those things. It was a chant they rehearsed at the beginning and end of every meeting they had with her. She had intended to brand it into the brains of the envoys. The sun was approaching the western horizon, and the sky was shifting from its daytime blue to its oranges and reds. He had left the coast entirely, searching for the tidal terminator so he could sleep without fear of being rudely awakened by waves crashing down on him. After a few minutes of walking, climbing up a small hill, he found the high water mark. It was closer than he expected, even at the increased elevation. Although the light was dimming, there was no mistaking it, so he climbed to the top, dropped his gear, and made camp for the night. When he laid down, the cool breezes and the general good health he was in made falling asleep easy. He slept deeply and fast. In what seemed like 15 minutes after losing consciousness, he was awake, witnessing the sunrise, completely baffled. The envoy was on an island. Although he understood what was happening, he still had a hard time believing it. He appeared to be on a tiny island and way out to sea. The coast was visible, but it was far enough that he never even considered trying to swim the distance. It was over a half-mile. To the north, he saw multiple more rounded peaks popping out of the ocean surface, making an archipelago. Much further to the north, he saw darkness on the horizon, which he expected was another storm, a storm that he would be more than happy to have missed him entirely. He had been enjoying the rain-free days. The archipelago could reduce the amount of walking he would have to do if he could island hop during low tide. In that moment, it was an annoyance, but there was nothing he could do until the tide receded. Well, except for this, he thought, and went to his bag for another vial. At least I don't have to get wet for this one. He snapped the container full of special salt and flicked the whole of it as far as he could in the direction the breeze was traveling. When the tide pulled back, he gathered his supplies and walked off the western edge of the island, which was just a hill again, onto the wet ground and resumed his northerly trek. 12. After walking for 2 days, he could see that the storm clouds in the far north were not clouds at all, but exactly the thing he was looking for: mountains. It took him 7 more days to reach them. During that time, he used the islands to sleep on 4 more times. He deposited the salts 8 more times, having made 2 dives on the 5th day, which was abnormally warm. The beach gave way to a slope on the 7th day. Before starting his climb, he filled his bottles with ocean water. The young ocean was still fresh, which surprised him every time he jumped into it. Only 20 paces up the slope, the terminator line was apparent. The envoy stopped, knowing he was leaving the ocean, but would visit an ancient version of it when he awoke. He did not speak to the ocean as he had the apartment that aided him, but he smiled at it. Before continuing, he took the packet with its 2 remaining vials out of his bag. He took the entire packet and bent it back and forth, feeling the remaining vials bend and pop in his hands. He worked them repeatedly until he was sure they were both cracked and open. Before he cast the packet into the ocean, he noticed a bit of the salt leaking to the earth below, and he nodded. It was a triple redundancy, and unnecessary to do at all, but he wanted to be rid of the packet. One less thing to carry around. With a smooth motion and a sharp flick of the wrist, he threw the packet like a frisbee, and it plunked into the crashing waves 10 feet below. The envoy began the physically taxing process of climbing. His daily travel distances diminished by much more than half for 2 reasons. Climbing was exhausting, and the higher elevation reduced the already poor oxygen concentration. He passed out twice, collapsing where he stood. He suffered no injuries from the events but thought better of letting it continue to happen. Another fall could mean a broken arm or a split skull. He took it slow and took frequent breaks. He had experienced a comfort, or a sense of accomplishment, as he ascended, seeing the ocean get further and further away. Still traveling north, he reached a vertical rock face that he could not navigate. He turned west, as an easterly direction would have eventually deposited him violently back into the ocean. 4 times after that, he reached areas of the landscape that were too steep to climb, and he descended, still always moving forward, never backtracking. Twice he had slipped on loose sand or gravel, badly enough that he lost his footing and made an abrupt visit to the earth below. He had sustained no serious abrasions from the falls, but he had badly bruised his right hip on the first occurrence. He was at the base of his latest diversion and staring up at a long, smooth incline. It was steep, but he believed he could traverse the grade. The most interesting thing was that he could see nothing above the slope but sky. He wanted to know what the view would be like at the top. He had thrown the last of the salts into the ocean 11 days before that. It had rained 8 times, which kept his water bottles filled. His food was dwindling, but not yet alarmingly so. He imagined he had a few weeks left, but his ribs were approaching skeletal, and his gut was concave, a condition he had not experienced since his beginnings on Telred. Judging by the position of the sun, he expected he had another 2 or 3 hours before dark, so he started the climb. Slow but persistent, he got 2/3 of the way up before the sun dipped below the horizon. The thought of sleeping on the grade and rolling over in his sleep scared him, so he continued the climb in the fading sunlight. When he reached the top, it was dark. The moon was not visible, so he was traveling by starlight, which amounted to no light. He felt his way up the grade for the last 20 minutes of the climb. When his hand finally escaped the slope and reached a flat spot, he scrambled up onto it and collapsed. Exhausted, sleep was almost immediate.